Jack Rusk and Vaclav Hasik. Did I say your name right? Hopefully, from C.Scale and Building Transparency, respectively. So they're going to be giving some of you guys are, I'm guessing a lot of people on this call are probably familiar with their respective tools, and so they'll be giving some updates as to just where things are with that. And so yeah, and then we'll do that for kind of like the first 30 minutes or so here, and then we'll open it up for questions for the latter portion of the meeting. So with that, I'll hand it off to Jack and Václav.
In the classic Jack and Václav double billing, I often go first, but do you have a preference, Václav?
No, we can just keep on doing the same thing.
Václav and I presented yesterday as well together, so we are on a roll. Cool. Well, really happy to be here. I think, as I mentioned, as folks were trickling into the call, I am recently living in New York City as well, so I'm excited to be tapped into this community, and would be exciting to whatever I can to hang out with y'all in person. I'm excited to be there. I'll share my screen. By the sort of briefest kind of introduction, C.Scale is an outgrowth, the spinout of EHCD, an architecture practice in San Francisco and Seattle. About 6 months ago, we formed a separate entity to really focus on building tools to make whole life carbon decision making more accessible to more people, with really the goal of enabling some sort of whole life carbon assessment and reduction on every project everywhere. That really remains our North Star. I'll talk some more about the kind of like the way we conceptualize that, how to accomplish that. But really, this is the thing we're angling towards as an entity. I know that this is really like a 201 group, we'll say, but I think just to take a step back and think about the frame that we sort of put around LCA and why it matters, is that the decisions we make every day as designers, engineers, architects, planners, portfolio owners, literally sort of reshape the world around us. Far-flung supply chains, that are often global in scale, are affected by the strokes of the pen or the polyline, right? That are made every day. And while there's sort of extractive realities, there's also the potential for regenerative capacities in the way we build. Many things cut both ways, and there's a lot of complexity in the way these supply chains sort of come together, and the way that resources and people and processes are all marshaled together to put a building in place. And really, we see life cycle assessment as the tool that helps us tell the difference. We're often, there's a very, I think, reasonable and critiques of what's often referred to as carbon tunnel vision. I think we should take that seriously, while also understanding there's an importance in finding metrics that allow us to capture a lot of complexity all together in something that's easy to understand. And we are really excited, I think, about the industry alignment around decarbonization, because it has the potential to create these sort of reverberating positive consequences in our cities, in the supply chains that feed them, and also obviously the energy infrastructures, that power the buildings. When we think about these things, especially in the present moment, one statistic that gives me some buoys my heart is that designers have purchasing power of something like 2 orders of magnitude more than the average consumer. There's things obviously that we should be doing as individuals. There's things we should be doing as a society, and still the decisions we make on these projects every day really are shifting procurement patterns globally. So how do we use that positively? Of course, designers are only one part of a larger ecosystem that is helping to reshape the built environment and the way we design and deliver buildings. This is really a figure I love that the Carbon Leadership Forum put out in the Advancing the LCA Ecosystem report a few years ago. And it helps us understand the way that accessible tools work together with reporting databases, stronger standards, better data. And really, these are all kind of interconnected cogs. And for anyone to turn, they all need to turn. So Václav and I We'll be talking today about tools. Building transparency does a lot in some other sections, other cogs here, but like there's really an interdependence between practitioners, policy, databases, nonprofits, et cetera. And the more we're talking to each other and collaborating, the stronger all these efforts will be. There's been a lot of talk recently about the way that policy that sort of would regulate or require life cycle assessment. There's been obvious headwinds at the federal level. Things like the federal Buy Clean initiatives and the GSA's P100 decarbonization or facility guidelines that had a big focus on decarbonization have been rolled back at this point. But again, we see a lot of action in California with some really exciting regulations coming on board. There's nascent efforts at New York State level, Executive Order 23 in New York City. There is a patchwork of regulations that I think will do a lot actually to take up some of the slack and unify industry around a set of practices that will continue to be meaningful. But with some of the like sort of federal landscape changing, we also have to ask ourselves like what's going to be the connective tissue across all of this. When we only have these really spotty regulations in place, what's going to help the next project, the one that's not the shiny headquarters, the one that's relatively smaller, doesn't have the budget, do the sort of whole life carbon assessment and really target these reductions. And for us, it's these kind of projects on the margin or these firms on the margin, like the people not on this call, that we're really excited about. It's like, how do we expand and strengthen this practice to really try to create something that really can help get this onto every project everywhere. And this is maybe, I don't know exactly how this reference is going to land, but there's this book that Tom Steyer wrote recently about cheaper, faster, better, about sort of like the criterias of the solution set that we need to move forward the climate action. He says, how will win the climate war? I'm not sure I would use that language, but it's really like, this is what we, I think, care about, really bringing to the industry is cheaper, faster, and better solutions for whole life carbon decision making. But the one thing Tom missed in this title that is really important to us is that these tools are also workflow integrated. So that would be my kind of amendment to his title. And this is something that we like try to take really seriously in our work, is targeting not only reporting compliance at the end of the project, but the decision-making process around the way and making sure the right data is available at the right time to drive decisions when they matter most. Doing this though, and this is where we'll get sort of maybe into the 201 part of this presentation, requires some subtlety, because along the way in the design process, there's a lot you don't know. Often the decisions, when you're making these decisions, you're making them in very data scarce environments. There's the thing we were all taught, when we like took the AREs or in the professional practice class, which is this very nice linear workflow that projects move through from early conceptual design to construction administration. And maybe along the way, the idea that I think we see in a lot of thinking around workflow integrated LCA is that you're moving from a very rough to a very specific idea of a project. And in many ways, like this is true, like broadly, we go from knowing very little to knowing a lot. But as I sort of want to point out here, I think there's more layers of complexity that exists actually in the way workflows happen. And then when we think about building, LCA tools for these earlier and fuzzier phases of design, the way we have to reconcile some parts of that. This is another way that we sort of think about it. Again, like abstracting a very messy process into a linear process that really over the course of a design, you go from having, some typical data that for us is predicted from sort of, we'll say like historical patterns, moving forward into actual project data. And at any different part of this process, there's a mix of the two, data from different sources. This may be that you have really well-described quantities data, but the supply chain data, is generic or industry average. Or maybe it's that the quantities data itself is, more like predicted. You haven't been able to finish like the drywall takeoffs, but it's about this big, whatever that ends up being. There's always unknowns along the way. And one thing that we posit is that these unknowns are quantifiable. Like there's a way to sort of fill in these gaps and understand the things that are missing or not yet modeled to help fill in the picture with predicted data. And really taking this approach where we're leveraging available project data and combining or augmenting it with predicted data allows us to meet workflows, we hope, sort of where they're at, which is to say, like, this is sort of a joke that started internally, but that like this nice sort of flow from one phase to the next is actually much more complicated. And as one part of the design, you know, you're putting out a structural package, say, just as for the steel above ground as you're redesigning the, you know, the foundation. Like there's everything is contingent and moving at different paces and rates. And our goal is to build design tools that facilitate a process that sort of works more like this, that's much messier, where you might have a lot of resolution around a certain set of, like a certain aspect of the design, but no resolution on the other. Even when we get to as-built, there's sort of often the idea that then we finally have the source of truth for the building. I think people who have reviewed or done as-built LCA know that there's still a lot of interpolation that needs to happen to understand parts of that. So how do we build processes and tools that allow us to work at different levels of resolution for different building systems? And this is really crucially, I think, something we are moving towards in C.Scale as we, through the course of 2025, make good on, you know, the sort of like the process we've started sort of at the beginning of this year after the spin out from EHDD and some external investment. We're excited to build tools and visualizations to help people make decisions. This is a like really brief screen recording showing the how changing the massing can have an emissions difference, or that changing, say, from a reinforced concrete to a podium building might, you know, have some effect, changing the interiors, but using these sort of data visualizations to help people see and address hotspots iteratively. So rather than an approach where you have to do all the design and then come back, right, to, we'll say, make the decision, you know, like trying to close that iterative loop to really be able to quickly test what if scenarios to understand the decisions that matter most. In another kind of example, one thing we're really excited about is these sort of like time series planning, which is, I think, is important for on projects when you understand the whole life carbon perspective, but also for owners and portfolio managers who are planning many projects over longer lengths of time. This is a retrofit project that we were helping a client look at recently in Atlanta, and it's really exciting to me to help designers understand where these crossing points are between different scenarios, how to understand like the mix of reuse that is most impactful, and where what the sort of, we'll say, like carbon payback period is for a certain sort of upfront design. In addition to the work that we do within our tool, which I can give a brief demo of in a moment, we're also really excited to be working with Autodesk Forma. They have a small part of the C.Scale model embedded in the Forma tool. I think we get asks, like, dare I say, every week for us to develop a 3D design tool. Developing 3D design tools, maybe some people on this call have tried. It's hard, y'all. And rather than sort of like spending our resources building the next geometry kernel, it's been really exciting to focus with people who are really, really good at that and leverage some part of our models and data to help a much wider set of folks come to the table. And again, like that gets back to the why of this work for us, which is getting these tools into everybody's hands everywhere. So the tool is available open access at cscale.io. We're at about maybe 20 minutes after, so actually I don't think I'll do a demo. I can pass it off to Vaclav. And yeah, but super happy to follow up with anybody on this call. Thank y'all.
Sounds good. Let me share my screen. 1 second. All right. So, thank you, Jack. Nice presenting with you again. I'm going to go over a couple of things first, you know, kind of keep it 101 and then switch to some of the updates that we're planning to our tools, EC3 and Tally. And so for anyone who doesn't know, Building Transparency, we are a nonprofit organization based out of Washington State. and we're focused on providing open access data and tools for the construction and, for the AEC industry. We have the Tally LCA tool, which you may know, from using it as a Revit plugin. And then we have the EC3 tool, which is mainly known for its database of VPDs, but it also has some project planner features. We are supported by all of these partners. So, our work wouldn't be possible to be, almost completely free to use to anyone in the industry without the support of these folks. With that, I do want to say that there's some that contribute more than others on this list. And we've recently had some challenges with one of our major funders. So you'll see, some of the stuff that I'm presenting today, some updated timelines and some of the updates to EC3 and Tally as a result of some of the changes to funding. And it's just the landscape that we are in today. So just one kind of a background note on everything. In terms of our tools again, Tally, if you're not familiar, this is new. Otherwise, this is more of a 101. Tally is really focused on the later design stages, and then EC3 is focused on the construction or sort of as-built phases. It can also be used during design, but it's really, initially built for the contractors in mind. And Tally has been used in the conceptual and planning phases before, but it really isn't built for that. And so it's really great to see tools like Jack's that really fill that void in that design and construction process. And again, a couple more 101 slides, and then I'll get to the updates. So Tally LCA is a whole building LCA tool, so it includes all life cycle stages. And it's really focused on making those systematic design changes to your building, including, evaluating different types of envelope systems for entire sections of a building. Sometimes swapping out different material types, but it's not in the current state. It's not really great at comparing different supply options or manufacturer options for the same type of material. That's really where the EC3 tool comes into play and excels. It focuses on extracting environmental impact data for the A1 to A3 stages specifically. We do have some data for the other stages as well, but we take all of this from environmental product declarations, where really the A1 to A3 data is the most useful part of that document. It allows you to know exactly what that specific manufacturer's impact actually is for that product. As I mentioned, we also have the plan and compare buildings feature in EC3, which also allows you to assess the transportation from the manufacturer to the project site. And then if you have data on construction and installation resource use, then you can also include A5 in there. With that, I'll switch to some of the updates that we have. This is hopefully some of the more interesting stuff for most of the folks on the call. And we'll start with EC3, and these are some of my older slides actually from earlier this year before we had to kind of reshuffle our timelines. But we did some significant prep and research into our user interface updates, and specifically around actually making it 508 compliant. So this is the essentially accessible user interface for, that's required for any tools used by any federal agencies. We've also, had some category updates in our queue, specifically the CMU and masonry grout updates. And with that, basically we update some of the filtering mechanisms, clean up the data, and then release it publicly. As you may know, there's some certain public categories in EC3 and then others that are still in pilot. Those pilot ones are essentially the ones that we always need more resources to kind of curate, improve the searching mechanism, and ensure that when people use EC3, they are actually mostly comparing comparable products, right, that do the same job. That's really big part of what we think about when we release some of these categories publicly and how we structure everything as well. So some of these updates are sort of on hold right now, but I think we should be able to start releasing them and work on them a little bit more in the coming months again. I think the more interesting and broader update that we have in mind is this planning stage for EC3 V2 in general, and really thinking about some of the usability improvements that we could make to EC3. The tool is now about 5 years old, and we've gathered a lot of user feedback over the years, and also better understand some of the different use cases for the tool that are out there. So we have some of these updates in mind, and we're kind of laying out the plan for EC3 V2, which we should really embark on sometime early next year, and then hopefully start rolling out those updates throughout the year next year. In terms of updates to Tally LCA, so we have the current version of Tally, which, as you know, is only available until the version of Revit 2024. And the reason why we did that was because we actually embarked on the Tally 2.0 update, so a major update to the tool. And we were hoping to have that wrapped up pretty much about now. So it didn't really make sense to do 2 updates at the same time. Now, with some of the some of the changes organizationally, we've been forced to push out the release of Tally 2.0 to a little bit later this year, including the beta, which will happen later this summer. And with that, we also understand that people are still working on projects today, and there are 2 new Revit versions by now, so Revit 2025 and 2026. So with that, we're actually currently doing that typical annual update of Tally LCA, and in June, we should be able to install it in Revit 2025 and 2026. Some of the other updates that we actually have planned specifically for Tally 2.0 is a little bit better communication between EC3 and Tally. So in the current state, as you know, you can create your Tally LCA model, and then you can push the quantities to EC3, and that's pretty much it. There's no bidirectional communication there. And also, it's really hard to push EC3 environmental product declaration data into the Tally library currently. So we're making some major changes to how all of that works with Tally 2.0, and there's going to be much better bidirectional communication. So some of the EPD data that you see in EC3 will be much easier to get into Tally 2.0. So it'll be faster and easier to keep that the impact library up to date. With that, we did still make some changes to the environmental impact data in Tally 1.0, actually at the end of last year, specifically around some of the main materials that we know everyone's using and that we're using some of the older EPD data. And so we've updated some of the wood product data with latest industry-wide EPDs, some of the steel, cement, and XPS insulation data, because we know that there were some major changes in the impacts from those environmental product declarations. I already touched on the updates to Revit 2025 and 2026, so I'll skip that part and go straight to some of the updates that we have planned for Tally 2.0. So here you see the updated dates. Again, we are targeting a release in fall of 2025 for Tally 2.0. And some of the major changes besides the integration of data from EC3 is actually completely restructuring how the end-of-life models work, or end-of-life impact estimates work. So before, all of the end-of-life impacts were kind of built in to the environmental impact library from the get-go, and they were directly tied to each of the material types that were in the Tally library. What we are doing with this restructuring is we're actually decoupling the impacts of individual end-of-life paths or fates. So for example, landfilling of wood products, landfilling of steel products, incineration of wood products, those will be their individual end-of-life paths essentially. And then there's going to be, the percentage likelihood of any of those scenario happening connected to the material data. And so you will actually be able to change those percentage ratios and even the end of life fates if you wanted to. It's also going to allow us to be a little bit more flexible and again, make better updates, more frequent updates to some of the underlying data as the tool evolves. We're also changing the structure to the global warming potential results. So as you know, in the previous tally, there was GWP with biogenic carbon and GWP without biogenic carbon. And we're restructuring it to be a little bit more up to date with the ISO and EN standards, and are actually separating out fossil, biogenic, specifically, as it's outlined in the new standards. And I think the last sort of more exciting or most exciting update is that we will actually have live results within the tool itself. You know, in the past, you've had to model everything, export a report, and then look at the PDF and Excel set of, results. Now you will have actually, embedded results charts within the tool itself. So you'll be able to see changes as you go through your modeling, which I think is critical in terms of immediate understanding of the potential impacts of your projects. So here I'll just quickly go through some of the screenshots of the tool, and apologies for the low resolution. These were some of the early screenshots that we took from the tool, but I think hopefully it still gives you a better idea of what to expect coming in a couple of months. So we haven't really changed the general user interface. We know that most people were, pretty familiar and comfortable with that user interface. The one thing that we're changing is that this is actually sort of running a web browser within a window inside of Revit. And what that allows us to do is actually then also allow people to review the results even outside of Revit, if you wanted to. It doesn't necessarily allow you to use Tally outside of Revit just yet, but maybe someday in the future, you will also be able to assign and get all of the material data without having a Revit project as well. In the current state, you will have to have the Revit project first, assign all the data. But if you wanted to go and share the results with somebody else, then you could do that without actually sharing the Revit model as well. I already talked a little bit about changes to the data structure. So here's just another visual graphic of what we've added. So in the, you obviously can't see anything on the chart on the right, but the main point here is that Tally 1.0 was essentially using the data model that's in the bottom two bounding boxes. And so it was really constrained to kind of what we could do actually in the background in terms of improving some of the calculation methods behind the tool. And so we've added this upper right bounding box, which includes, as I mentioned, different end-of-life pathways, different transportation scenarios, and the fact that the user will then have a little bit more control over, actually modifying some of the scenarios. They don't have to all be sort of pre-built into the tool. Here's just an example of the specific changes to the global warming potential and other environmental impact category structure within the tool. And as you can see here, the one other thing that I didn't note was that we're also including Tracy as well as EN-based environmental impact categories in the tool. And so what this will allow us to do is actually serve better, not just the North American market, but potentially then, add more data points for European and other markets that may be using a different set of environmental impact indicators. Here's an example of the live view on the results charts, and also live view of a table that you can then adjust. You don't have to, work inside of an Excel table. You can do some of the adjustments of the data that you see and how you analyze it directly within the plugin on the right side. The visuals of the charts in the initial release will be very similar or pretty much identical to Tally 1.0, but again, because this is going to be a live version of the results, you actually will be able to hover over things and a little bit better understand some of the specific values on the chart. You know, in the past, it was always really hard to just, you know, distinguish between different colors in the PDF charts. You would always have to go into the Excel spreadsheet to really understand the numbers if there was, you know, similarity between some of the graphics in the PDF report. So finally, you will be able to just hover over certain parts of the diagram. There's also going to be various export options of the results. So you will still be able to export the results into Excel files. You know, we know a lot of people use their own company-wide portfolio management and visualizations tools that were relying on those Excel reports. So that's still going to be an option. We also are going to have an option of exporting a JSON file. So for anyone that's that's developing internal tools within a company, you will also be able to use a more developer-friendly format as well. And there are some additional changes to some of the structure of the data, especially around the project level information that we're now aligning with some of the standard naming and description protocols that were developed as part of the ECHO project, which is the Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization project that you may have heard of. So hopefully reporting to various certification programs and other things will become a little bit easier. I think this is my last, maybe this is one of the last slides. So in terms of design option comparisons that you may be familiar with, we still have that feature, but we've added a couple more improvements. So you will be able to do the design option comparison, but also include the rest of the building that you may not necessarily have modeled as a design option in Revit. So I think that's a big improvement. You really get the context of the changes, not just within what is changing within your particular design options, but you get the context relative to the entire building. And we're also, I don't have any screenshots for the material substitutions, but we are implementing some improvements where it's easier just to substitute a material within a certain element. You don't have to actually then model it as a design option, which, it's basically unnecessary for you to remodel a portion of a building just to swap a material type. So we're trying to make that a little bit easier. Other improvements are in terms of, covering adaptive reuse projects or reuse of elements in general. There is now going to be a native comparison feature for if you're working on an adaptive reuse project and you've marked a bunch of components as reused or refurbished, then you don't actually have to, generate two separate results reports. You will be able to simply click a button and get that comparison of a adaptive reuse versus as new project of the same exact type and geometry directly within the tool. And I think this is the last slide. Just some minor, or they may seem like minor improvements to the usability of the element browser. In the past, you had to go, if you wanted to copy definitions or apply them across multiple different elements, the copy process wasn't as intuitive and as straightforward as you would expect it to be from any other tool that you're using. So you've made some changes so it better aligns to the typical convention that you might see. So you'll be able to click on an element and click Control-C or for copy, and then paste it the same way onto other elements. You don't have to go through that Tally specific process of copying definitions. The other small improvement here is that you will also be able to assign or define the building elements classification directly within the element browser. So in the past, there was this chart where you could see contribution by building elements in the Tally results, in the Tally report. But a lot of people are always struggling in understanding how do you actually get the elements assigned to some of these systems. And you had to go back into the Revit model and you had to assign the assembly code to the right unit format code, essentially. And so instead of doing that, you will be able to actually define what the unit format classification system assignment to that element is directly within the plugin in Tally 2.0. And that was really the last slide. If you have any more questions, I'll be able to answer them in the remaining time, or you can contact me at this address. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. Open it up for questions.
I can start. So nice to hear from both of you. Jack, we're excited to have you in town. And Vaclav, I've heard a lot about you, but I don't think we've met previously. I'm Aurora. I'm with Carbon Leadership Forum. I am really excited to see the changes for Tally. I think I'd heard about bits and pieces of them, but that is just an incredibly needed update. And if what you just described is coming out in the version later this year, that is so exciting. My question is around the data vintage of the background data and some of the updates that were planned there and the timeline for that. And maybe I just missed it, but was just curious about the data for generic, more like industry-wide materials and things like.
Yeah, I didn't really mention that in the slides, but I guess I alluded to it in the slides, I think. So we're actually working on a project of developing generic data where there are not a lot of EPDs, representing some of the material types. That's called the ODCI project, Open Data for Climate Initiative. And that data is essentially equivalent to what you saw in the previous or in the current version of Tally, in terms of the Gabi data that was there. Except it's now actually being developed specifically to be open access, and it's specifically under, with our input actually in terms of what we need for that data. And it's going to also cover not just the North American market, but other markets as well. And the idea is that there will be an opportunity for more organizations to collaborate and contribute to that open access data set of generic materials. And hopefully that also means there are more frequent updates. So for example, we could do annual updates. But this is sort of the inaugural year, and we're still working on the first set of data coming from that project. And so there have been some delays to that development as well. And so everything is kind of shifting back towards the later time of the year. So that's on the generic data. In terms of the EPDs, which I think I know we get a lot of requests about EPDs in Tally. And in the initial release of Tally 2.0, we're focusing on filling in all of the industry-wide EPD data that we have. And then later on, we'll also slowly start integrating some of the product-specific EPD data as well, I think. The major challenge that we're facing is that, as you know, in differences in PCRs sometimes cause differences in the available environmental impact results that are in the EPDs. And there's a lot of sort of alignment that needs to happen before data gets, on all of the environmental impact categories, gets into a tool like Tally LCA. It's a slightly different discussion when we talk about just global warming potential. When you start considering all the other impact categories, it just becomes, a different kind of beast. So hopefully that helps.
I am also thrilled to see so many updates coming to Tally. We use Tally frequently. And I'm curious with the updates how kind of if or how we're going to be able to compare to past Tally analysis. Like, is Tally 2.0 really like a result we get in that for a project? Will we be able to compare it to a past project we've done in any meaningful way? Or are we just going to have to kind of say, okay, we did all of this analysis before, we understood some things, we understood what was better or worse about these things. and we're kind of not starting over, but we're kind of recreating our internal benchmarks and baselines, and like kind of maybe more broadly, like how does it compare to other benchmarks that have been created, like the CLF benchmark and various other things?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't have a good answer to yet, because we haven't run the tests or comparisons that would be needed to answer that question, right? There's going to be differences because obviously we're changing the underlying environmental impact data pretty much completely, right? There's going to be some overlaps because even current version of Tally uses some EPD data. And usually the A1 to A3 impacts are the majority of the impacts, right? So there should still be some alignments there. But in terms of replacing some of the generic data, there's going to be some changes. I can't tell you to what extent. In terms of changing assumptions for some of the other life cycle stages like transportation and end of life, again, there's going to be some changes, but overall, I don't think they should affect the results that much because we're sticking kind of, it's the same calculation. We're slightly adjusting some of the underlying data, but usually it's relatively small compared to A1 to A3. The recommendation, at least at the beginning, is going to be to continue your projects that you have running currently in the version of Tally that you have been using. And that's because one, which you mentioned, there could be significant changes in the results. We don't want to confuse you. Like, just because the underlying data doesn't mean that your decisions actually should have changed back then, right? And the other thing is that the models won't actually be transferable at the beginning. You'd have to do a lot of mapping to be able to enable that. So you won't easily be able to switch your model from Tally 1.0 to Tally 2.0. And I know that it could just take a long time for you to kind of remodel everything anyway. So eventually we hope to have that feature in there, but it's just a matter of mapping everything between those two tools.
And maybe a similar question is as far as when for Tally 2.0 and maybe even for C.Scale, when it's pulling the latest industry data, do you know, because like NRMCA, I know, for example, like updates their data every 2 years on like industry averages and that kind of thing. And so do you give the user the ability to toggle like the year of like for the industry baselines, or is it just kind of using the latest that EC3 is pulling?
I can again quickly go ahead. So it's because of the changes to the structure of the data that we are building in, we will be able to have multiple versions of data representing the same material type. And normally it will revert to the currently most applicable data point, but you will actually be able to then also change, material assignments on your own project. Similarly, as you might be able to do today in EC3, right? You could remove the expiration date in EC3 today and see all the historical data and just pick one that you want to see. That essentially will be available in Tally 2.0 as well. Yeah.
There's something maybe to kind of disambiguate there, which is the updates to the NRMCA data, right, should represent something like the market mix of materials at that particular time. So updating the NRMCA, like old models to use new MRMCA data might be less accurate somehow because those buildings and that were constructed with concrete from those supply chains at that time. So it's not necessarily that like newer data is better for newer projects, but the older NRMCA data might be more appropriate for previously constructed models.
Great point.
I'll jump in here. I'll echo, I love hearing about all the updates for Tally and understanding how that's working with EC3 and stuff. I do have a question for C.Scale, actually too. So I'm a structural engineer, and so what I'm wondering is when you're looking at the massing and stuff, does that factor in? I haven't dug around in it too much yet. We see a lot that can impact the upfront embodied carbon with the design in regards to how much of a, it really comes down to the cantilevers and the transfers and how substantial those are. Do you, you just glowed up there, so I feel like you have an answer. Is there a way to struggle with that at all?
Yeah, there's no good answer here, and that like in the tool as we have it, we're not really supporting
Okay.
3D design. And the cantilevers, to understand those, you sort of have to understand like we use sort of statistical methods to get our early estimates based on reported quantities across a range of buildings. And I think we're going to go straight from that actually to something like the ability to upload and structure a bill of quantities. Because the middle ground is actually very difficult to understand things like we've gone through many iterations of trying to describe things like cantilevers in different ways, but there's no, obviously no one size fits all solution. We're generally happy with like the statistical predictions for early phase design, but it does leave still this uncanny valley, which where some of those things like the massing implications, we'll say, like are real. I think there's a lot of other parameters that people want, but you look at something like the SE 2050 data analysis report, and there's very few clear signals in the data that show like significance of one sort of like variable or another. Grid size sometimes matters, right? But you might just be like moving structural quantities between girders, beams, and columns sometimes when you're changing the grid. So we try to expose parameters that have clear, we'll say like directional effects, and suppress ones like, marginal changes in grid size, which don't. I agree with you on the cantilevers for sure.
Yeah.
Really hard to describe the impact without something very much more specific.
So just if I understand correctly, the C-Scale is kind of assuming, I don't know where you're getting your inputs in for the massing. So if we're looking at different massing blobs, it's just kind of assuming standard gravity loads. Only just because I'll say we have projects where it'll be like the Jenga style gravity defying versus your more conventional. And that's probably about a 15% swing right there in embodied carbon for the superstructure. So it can be fairly significant.
Yeah, so we like again, we're making predictions based on like our quantities prediction comes from quantities like that we've collected across many projects.
That are all varied types.
All varied types, exactly. And
cantilevers and transfers in there. Okay.
Exactly. And then we have this parameter that is like for any particular set of parameters that a user puts in, we do many predictions, create a distribution from all those predictions. And we have a structural material quantity intensity. It's a lot of words, but toggle, where basically like you could say, okay, like this is going to be a relatively more materially efficient structure. We'll swing it one direction. This, for a building of this form, will be relatively more materially intensive, inefficient, and you could swing it that direction. Again, just to get sort of early, like
that's perfect. Yeah, that's what I was
of what those impacts are. Cool.
Nice.
There's no number of cantilevers you have button yet, Jack?
Well, it's oversimplified.
I'm sweating thinking about what that would do.
Well, no, Jake.
I was just gonna say,
another question.
yeah, if anyone has any questions, about anything besides, Tally or C.Scale, please also bring that up at the last like 5 minutes, I guess, of our tools group. But yeah, I think presentation is great. But Suzanne, I'll let you ask.
Well, no, I was just gonna say, so we're Tally users and we work on projects that sometimes we'll use one-click and stuff or other softwares and stuff. And one thing I think we really appreciate Tally is the back-end transparency of just all the numbers. We can easily pull that out and validate or find some, misrepresentation that had been pulled through the Revit model and stuff. I think the downside had always been the understanding the inputs that were going into the traditional Tally if you weren't pulling it through EC3 and stuff. So just to verify, in the 2.0 version, it looks like you're going to have full transparency of both like default values as well as specific values for your impact, all the different stages, as well as the output for the embodied carbon and the quantities, whether it's in kilograms or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, because of the change of the underlying impact data, it will also allow us to just be more generally transparent about all of the values and where they come from. In the past, we couldn't just share everything because of some of the licensing limitations with the underlying data. But now we're, relying either on EPD data that's already public, or for the other life cycle stages, we're still mainly relying on publicly available data, mainly from the US agencies that have done a lot of LCAs on some of these different aspects. So we're trying to use as much openly accessible, transparent data as possible so that you have then, transparent look into the data that we use and have more confidence. Or can even dig deeper, into, okay, well, why is this way, right? So that's all part of the overall restructuring of the underlying data of Tally.
And you'll still have the spreadsheets. I know you have it
And-
real time in the
Yeah.
program within awesome. Perfect.
All right. Well, that's with 5 minutes left. I think a big news that came out fast since our last meeting is the MVP 2040 results were released, and that's really interesting. I think that's really cool. I don't want to dive into that with 4 minutes left, but maybe that's a topic for a future presentation. But maybe both the Vaclav and Jack, is there? I know C.Scale does have some MEP defaults built into it, but are there any things in the pipeline to kind of update that based off of the new MEP 2040 data that's been coming out and some of the default calculations that they're releasing for users to provide some sort of data on their projects?
Maybe the briefest comment there, and I think a note that comes up sometimes here that I think is I think often when there's one thing that we all need, which is greater interoperability between tools. I think Vaclav and I and Ryan at KT are talking about that in terms of C.Scale and Tally and EC3. I think 1Click2 will be part of that discussion, obviously. And with that, there's a lot that we hope to cover that is stuff that is not very well described in BIM. Interiors, MEP, site and landscape, feel like really complementary. We're in the middle of an exciting collaboration that we hope to describe more about soon with a super cool MEP firm that's going to be our sort of guiding light in developing those things. And in the meantime, in the next week or so, we're doing a major update to our refrigerants model. And I don't know exactly what the day jobs of people on this call are, but I think refrigerants are super important. I think many mechanical engineers do as well, and super under described. So you get into all sorts of other things, we'll say, when you start talking about mechanical systems.
You also bring up another good point with landscape materials that's going to be required for LEED, and this might just be a general question to the group: is is anyone calculating that currently across all of their projects or even just some of their projects? And curious maybe what your experiences are there. I think that's a no.
I can't speak from an active perspective, but in my former role, where I was performing a lot of whole building LCA with a wider team, we were doing hardscape calcs. And I think one of the challenges is, as Jack noted, that's not typically represented in BIM, maybe in 2 dimensions, but rarely in 3. So, having to cross-reference that with the 2-dimensional details that go along with it. And a blurriness about other subgrade infrastructure, like large precast pipes that are not clearly in or out of scope. I think they're often assumed to be out, and there's sort of almost a need to define a depth at which that hardscape calc is required, which I haven't seen in LEED yet. So some preliminary thoughts there. I think the materials are really consistent with what we're seeing in the buildings library, with the exception of more data around asphalt. But so materially it seems okay, but quantities, lots of best practices need to be defined in that area.
A brief response to that, like we find this actually when we talk to college campuses with scope 3 commitments, is that sort of civil scope, like the stuff outside the thermal envelope of the building, you know, all the stuff between the buildings and underground, ends up being like it's significant, you know, like the roadways, etc. So I think that's another. It's almost like a planning scale question, you know, more than it is like a buildings question.
All right, I think that'll be it. That is our time at 1 p.m. So, I know, Jared, if you want to sign everyone off here.
Yeah, no, thanks everyone for joining. I thought it was a great discussion here at the end, and special thanks to Jack and Vaclav for a great presentation. And yeah, we'll have another one in a few months. Sure, we'll send out an email. So keep an eye out for that.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Cal. Take care.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Yep.